Go watch the lights, Dad, my son whispered, then shut the truck door on the freezing Alaskan void, leaving me to be erased by the permafrost for the price of a life insurance policy. He thought a 68-year-old man was just a static load that would buckle under the cold, but he forgot that I spent 40 years calculating the breaking points of steel and stone, and I was about to show him exactly what happens when a structure fights back. If you're listening to this, hit that subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from. It helps to know there's still solid ground somewhere in this world. Let me tell you how a lifetime of building bridges led to the moment I had to watch my own family undergo a catastrophic collapse. The silence in my house wasn't a hollow thing. It was a pressurized weight. As a structural engineer for 40 years, I understood loads the way a beam deflects under gravity, the way a foundation groans when the earth shifts. But grief was a live load I hadn't calculated for. It pressed against the double-paned windows like the leaden Chicago sky, thick with the scent of impending snow. It muffled the world outside, turning the rhythmic pulse of the city into a distant, underwater thrum. It had been 2 years since Eleanor died, 2 years since the structural integrity of my life had suffered a catastrophic failure. This 4-bedroom colonial, once a masterpiece of suburban stability we bought 30 years ago, no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a decommissioning site, a museum of memories I was too tired to curate, where every dust mote dancing in a shaft of weak light felt like a particle of a life that had ceased to exist. I sat in my leather armchair in the study, surrounded by blueprints of bridges I'd built and skyscrapers that still stood tall, even as I began to crumble. The leather was cracked, mirroring the deep, weathered lines on my own hands that used to calculate stress points to the 4th decimal. Now they just shook. The room smelled of old pipe tobacco and the metallic tang of cold radiators. I was 68 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt the fatigue of the metal. I was reaching my yield point. I had spent my career looking for the weak link. I knew that a structure didn't usually collapse because of one big event. It collapsed because of a series of microscopic fractures, ignored for too long. I could spot a hairline crack in a load-bearing pillar from across a construction site. I understood the language of stone, steel, and tension. People, I had found, were much the same. They had their elastic limits. They had their failure states. But I had missed the fractures in my own family. Happy birthday, Dad. The voice didn't just break the silence. It fractured it. I looked up, my neck vertebrae clicking like a settling house. My son Daniel stood in the doorway. He was 32, possessing Eleanor's soft, empathetic chin. But he had my eyes, dark, analytical, and currently incredibly restless. Those eyes were a tell in any structure. They were shifting, looking at the floor, the molding, the exit, anywhere but at me. He was vibrating at a frequency that suggested internal instability. He held a bottle of wine by the neck. His knuckles were white, the tendons in his forearm taut. He wasn't holding a gift. He was holding a brace. He looked like a man trying to hold up a ceiling that was already coming down. Behind him, like a polished facade over a hollow core, stood Vanessa. My daughter-in-law was a woman of sharp angles and immaculate finishes. Her blonde hair was a structural marvel of its own, not a strand out of place. She wore a smile that reminded me of a glass curtain wall, beautiful to look at, but reflecting everything and revealing nothing. She worked in high-end real estate, selling forever homes to people who didn't realize that nothing is forever. She walked into the room and the ambient temperature seemed to drop, the humidity vanishing. "We have a surprise for you, Arthur," she said. Her voice was smooth, like polished marble, but marble is cold to the touch. I stood up, my knees popping with a sound like a joist under too much snow. "You didn't have to come all this way. It's just another year of depreciation." "We wanted to," Daniel said, stepping forward with a jerkiness that set my internal alarms off. He placed the wine on my desk, a heavy Cabernet, the kind that leaves stains you can't scrub out. Then he handed me a thick, silver envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive. "We know you've stuck," Daniel said. He used the word like a diagnosis. "Since Mom, we thought you needed a change of scenery, a new environment to reset your foundations." I opened the envelope. Inside was a glossy brochure, the Aurora Wilderness Lodge, Fairbanks, Alaska, and a plane ticket, first class. "The Northern Lights," Vanessa whispered, moving closer. She smelled of a perfume that was too floral for the winter, a scent that felt like a lie. You always told us it was the one that you and Eleanor never got to take. The one project you left unfinished. I looked at the image on the brochure, ribbons of emerald and violet dancing over a jagged, snowy peak. It was true. We'd had a jar in the kitchen labeled Alaska Fun for 2 decades. But the unforeseen loads of life always took priority. Braces for Daniel's crooked teeth, the skyrocketing tuition for his degree, the time the roof had literally leaked over our bed. The money always flowed into the cracks of the present. This is an enormous expense, I said, my voice thick with a sudden, confusing surge of hope. It's taken care of, Daniel said, his eyes darting to a shelf of engineering textbooks behind me. Vanessa had a record-breaking quarter. We want you to go. A private guide. A luxury cabin. Total isolation. Just you and the sky. I looked at my son. I saw the dark, bruised circles under his eyes. I knew his architectural firm was struggling. I'd seen the dip in the local rate, the lack of new permits. I knew Vanessa's appetite for luxury was a load his income couldn't support. And yet here they were, offering me a bridge back to the world. Are you sure? I asked, using the voice I used when I was inspecting a contractor's work. The one that demanded honesty. Vanessa didn't blink. We insist, Arthur. She placed a hand on my arm. Her fingers were thin and cold, like wire. Consider it a thank you for the down payment on our house. For everything. Go. Find some closure. Closure. It's a word people use when they want a story to end. The next morning, I went to see my doctor, Iris Thorne. He was a young man who looked like he'd been designed by a marketing team. Vanessa had recommended him after my old GP retired. He drove a Porsche that screamed debt and wore a watch that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. You're fit for the trip, Arthur, he said, his pen scratching rhythmically across a pad. But your vitals show stress. Your blood pressure is high. The walls are under too much pressure. I'm prescribing something for the anxiety, and to help you sleep at those altitudes. He handed me a bottle of bright orange pills. Take one every night, especially in the thin air. It helps with oxygenation. I've never been a fan of chemical stabilizers. Eris. Just for the trip, he insisted, his smile tight and plastic. Trust me, you don't want to be awake when the cold starts to bite. I spent the evening packing with the precision of a man preparing a site. Thermal layers, reinforced boots, gloves rated for sub-zero. I didn't tell Daniel, but I packed my old satellite phone, a rugged piece of tech from my days surveying remote bridge sites in the Yukon. I checked the battery, 100%. I tucked it into the hidden lining of my bag. It was a redundant system. Any good engineer knows you need a backup when the primary fails. Before I left, I walked to the front window. A black sedan was idling across the street, its exhaust plumes rising like ghostly signals in the cold air. It had been there for 3 hours. No one got out. No one went in. It was a shadow in the periphery, a variable I couldn't account for. The morning of the flight, Daniel drove me. He was a ghost behind the wheel, his hands gripping the steering so hard I could hear the leather groan. You okay, son? I asked, watching his profile. Fine. Just a lot of projects on the table, he said. He didn't look at me. Not once. When he dropped me at the curb, he didn't get out to hug me. He didn't wait to see me enter the terminal. He just accelerated away, his tires spitting slush onto my boots. He wasn't driving toward his future. He was fleeing a collapse. The flight was a sensory vacuum, recycled air, the hum of turbines and the artificial luxury of first class that felt like a sedative. I spent the hours staring at the structural diagrams of the Boeing 787 in the seat back pocket, tracing the load paths, trying to distract myself from the phantom pressure in my chest. When the cabin door opened in Fairbanks, the air didn't just enter, it invaded. It was 38 degrees below zero. In my profession, we call it thermal shock, the point at which materials become brittle, where steel can shatter like glass if struck correctly. It was a physical weight that froze the moisture in my nostrils and turned my breath into a jagged cloud of ice crystals. I stood on the curb, my heavy wool coat feeling like a sheet of paper against a gale. I was waiting for the luxury transport Vanessa had promised. What arrived was a battered Ford F-350, its body panels pitted by salt and gravel, its engine rattling with a rhythmic instability that suggested a failing bearing. It was a ruin held together by rust and sheer spite. A man stepped out, his movements heavy and deliberate. This was Carl. Carl was a man built of dense, unyielding materials. He looked like he had been carved out of wet granite and left to weather in a salt marsh. He wore a grease-stained parquet made of heavy canvas and furs that smelled of old blood and diesel. A hunting knife was strapped to his thigh in a worn leather sheath. A tool, yes, but its handle was polished from frequent use. "Penhaligon," he grunted. His voice was a low-frequency vibration, the kind that travels through the floorboards before you actually hear it. "Erher," I corrected, extending a gloved hand. He didn't take it. He just grabbed my expensive suitcase and tossed it into the open bed of the truck like it was a bag of gravel. "We have a 3-hour transit to the trailhead," Carl said, climbing back into the cab without waiting. "Then a hike. We need to reach the high-altitude cabin before the pressure front drops. If the wind picks up, the ridge becomes a no-go zone." "The itinerary said the lodge was accessible by road," I said, climbing into the passenger seat. The interior smelled of stale tobacco and the metallic tang of a heater working at its absolute limit. Carl smirked, a slow, ugly movement of his jaw. "The lodge is for tourists. Your daughter-in-law was specific," she said. "You wanted the authentic experience. The high-ridge isolation. No distractions. No crowds. Specific. In my line of work, specifications are everything. They define the limits of a project." Why did that word feel like a hairline crack spreading across a windshield? The drive was a lesson in desolation. We left the flickering lights of Fairbanks behind, heading north into a landscape that lacked any vertical landmarks other than stunted skeletal black spruce. The road was a ribbon of black ice. I watched Carl's hands on the wheel. They were steady, but his grip was predatory. "Been guiding long, Carl?" I asked, trying to find the resonance of the man. "Long enough to know who belongs out here and who doesn't," he muttered. "The wilderness has a way of finding the weak points in a man, Arthur. It's like a stress test. Most people from the city, they're made of soft wood. They snap under the first real load. I've spent my life studying stress," I replied quietly. "I know exactly where the breaking points are." We reached the trailhead as the sun, a pale and heatless disk, slipped behind the jagged horizon. The lodge was a series of remote outposts, each separated by miles of unforgiving terrain. Mine was the final one, a cabin perched on a limestone shelf known locally as Dead Man's Drop. I checked my phone. The screen was a blank slate. Searching for signal. "Sat phones don't work in this valley," Carl said, standing in the doorway of the cabin as I unpacked. He was silhouetted by the rising moon, a dark shape against the blue-white snow. High magnetite content in the surrounding rock. It creates a localized interference field. "You're off the grid now. Convenient," I whispered. "It's what was paid for," Carl replied. His eyes caught the light, cold, reflective, and entirely devoid of empathy. The cabin was a minimalist structure, built of heavy logs but showing signs of neglect. The floorboards groaned with a high-pitched protest as I moved. I sat on the edge of the narrow cot, my heart fluttering like a bird trapped in a chimney. I pulled the bottle of orange pills from my pocket, Dr. Thorne's oxygenation aid. I looked at them in the dim light of a kerosene lamp. In engineering, you never introduce a new chemical upon a sensitive system without knowing the reaction. I opened the bottle and sniffed. There was a faint, bitter odor. Valium, or perhaps something stronger. A sedative, something to ensure the subject remained compliant, something to make a fall look like a dizzy spell. I walked to the small iron sink and turned the bottle over. The pills clattered against the porcelain like tiny orange stones before I flushed them away with a bucket of gray water. If my foundation was going to fail, I wanted to feel every crack. I wanted to be awake for the collapse. I reached into my boot, feeling the cold steel of the folding knife I'd smuggled in. I strapped it to my inner thigh, hidden beneath my thermal layers. At midnight, Carl hammered on the door. "Lights are active. Move out." The hike was a brutal exercise in mechanical strain. The snow was knee-deep, a non-Nubian fluid that resisted every movement. My lungs burned, the frozen air feeling like shards of glass in my chest. Carl set a pace that was designed to break an old man. He didn't look back. He moved like a machine, his heavy boots rhythmic and punishing. "Keep up, Arthur," he shouted over the rising howl of the wind, "or the cold will settle in your joints and you'll never move again." We reached the ridge, a narrow spine of rock with a 1,000-foot vertical drop on the eastern side. The wind here was ferocious, a constant lateral load that threatened to push me off my center of gravity. "Stand there," Carl yelled, pointing to a shelf of sheer ice that overhung the abyss. "That's the spot. The aurora will peek right over that spire. Best view in the territory." I looked at the spot. It was a cantilevered shelf of packed snow and ice, inherently unstable. One shift in weight, one sudden impulse, and the entire structure would shear off. I looked at Carl. He wasn't reaching for a camera. He was adjusting his gloves, his body tensing, his feet finding a stable purchase on the solid rock behind the shelf. He was positioning himself for a thrust. "I'll stay right here, Carl," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I planted my boots on the exposed bedrock, 10 feet from the edge. Carl's face contorted. The guide mask shattered, revealing the jagged intent beneath. "Don't be a difficult old man. Move to the edge. Take the picture. Let's get this over with." "Vanessa didn't tell you?" I asked. "I'm a structural engineer. I don't stand on unreinforced overhangs, and I certainly don't stand in front of men who are leaning into a strike." Carl froze. He let out a short, dry laugh that was lost in the wind. "Smart guy. Vanessa said you had a head for figures. Too bad you didn't calculate the cost of your own life." He took a step toward me, his hands curling into clubs of meat and leather. "She's paying me 3 times what this trip cost, just to make sure you have a truly memorable accident. Disoriented, off your meds, slipped in the dark." "It's a clean narrative, Arthur. Very low stress. And my son?" I asked, the words feeling like they were being dragged over gravel. "The kid?" Carl spat on the ice. "He's just the passenger. She's the one driving the truck. Now you can go over the edge standing up, or I can break your legs and throw you over. Either way, the gravity remains the same." He lunged. Carl was younger, stronger, and possessed the momentum of a falling boulder, but he was overconfident. He saw a 68-year-old man as a static object. He didn't realize that even an old structure knows how to redirect a load. As he swung a heavy looping right hook, I didn't retreat. I stepped into his guard, dropping my center of gravity. I used the reinforced toe of my heavy winter boot, and drove it with every ounce of my fading strength into the lateral side of his patella. Crack! It was the sound of a dry branch snapping in a deep freeze. Carl's knee buckled inward, the ligaments failing instantly. He let out a guttural roar of agony and stumbled, his weight shifting violently. But he was massive. Even as he fell, he reached out and snagged the collar of my parka, his fingers locking like steel clamps. He dragged me toward the slick, angled ice of the drop. We hit the ground together, sliding toward the black emptiness. "If I'm going, you're coming with me," he wheezed, spit freezing on his lips. I felt my boots lose purchase. I looked over his shoulder into the void. My heart was redlined. I reached out, my hand brushing against the flare gun tucked into his belt. I ripped it free. I didn't aim for his head. I knew the physics of the mountain. Above us, a massive cornice of wind-packed snow hung like a loaded spring. I pointed the flare gun upward and pulled the trigger. Boom! The magnesium flare hissed into the overhang, the heat and the sonic vibration acting as the final straw. With a deep tectonic groan, the snow shelf fractured. "No!" Carl screamed, looking up. I released my grip on his coat and rolled violently toward the lee side of a rock outcropping. The avalanche was small, by mountain standards, but on this ridge it was a death sentence. A wall of white energy slammed into Carl, his broken knee preventing any hope of escape. It swept him off the ledge as if he were nothing more than dust on a table. His scream was brief, truncated by the wind, and then there was only the sound of shifting snow. I lay in the dark, my face pressed against the freezing rock. I was alive, but the structural integrity of my world had been completely annihilated. My son had sold me for the price of a life insurance policy. I didn't die, I thought, my fingers clawing into the ice. That was their first mistake. They forgot that I know how to rebuild. I didn't wait for the adrenaline to fade, because I knew that once it did, the hypothermia would settle into the marrow of my bones. I crawled away from the edge of Dead Man's Drop, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that tasted like copper and ozone. The avalanche had left a pristine, terrifying silence in its wake. I made it back to the cabin by sheer mechanical repetition, one boot in front of the other, calculating the angle of the slope to minimize the strain on my overworked heart. I found the snowmobile Carl had tucked behind the tool shed, a heavy-duty Scandic. The keys were still in the ignition. He had been so certain of the outcome, so confident in the finality of my accident, that he hadn't even bothered with basic security. It was a failure of redundancy. I thumbed the starter. The engine turned over with a violent metallic scream, before settling into a rhythmic thrum that vibrated through my frozen thighs. I rode for 3 hours through the white void, the wind chill likely hitting 60 below. The ice-laden air lashed at the exposed skin of my face, but I didn't feel the pain. I felt only a cold, incandescent fire. I wasn't a victim. I was a structural investigator, returning to the scene of a catastrophic collapse. I reached the Dalton Highway just as a timber hauler was pulling out of a rest stop. I flagged him down, a shivering specter in a high-end parka. I didn't offer a story. I offered $500 in damp, crumpled bills to get me to the Fairbanks terminal. "You look like you saw a ghost, old-timer," the trucker said, his cab smelling of burnt coffee and diesel. I looked at my reflection in the side view mirror. My face was a map of frostbite and fury. My eyes, once warm and grandfatherly, were now as hard and unforgiving as the permafrost. "No," I said, my voice sounding like grinding stones. "I am the ghost. I'm just waiting for the haunting to begin." I didn't go to the local authorities. As a man who had spent decades dealing with the slow grinding gears of the legal system, I knew what would happen. Statements, affidavits, a jurisdictional nightmare. Vanessa would be alerted. She would destroy the evidence, liquidate the accounts, and vanish before the first warrant was signed. No, a bridge doesn't just fall, it is taken down. I caught the red-eye to Chicago, sitting in the back of the plane, shrouded in a blanket, staring at nothing. I was measuring the distance between who I was and who I had to become. Chicago at 3:00 a.m. was a study in grays and deep shadows. The city hummed with a low-frequency anxiety that matched my own. I took a cab to within 2 blocks of my neighborhood, paying in cash and slipping into the shadows of the familiar oak-lined streets. My house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, a dark silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. It looked peaceful. It looked like a home. But I knew the foundation was rotten. Then I saw it, a black sedan, idling silently 3 houses down. The windows were tinted a deep, oily black. I recognized the stance of the car. It was a predator in repose. Julian Black. I knew the name from the architectural circles. He wasn't just a loan shark. He was a fixer for the desperate elite. He provided the capital when the banks realized the project was a lost cause. If he was here, it meant the debt had reached its critical load. He wasn't waiting for a paycheck, he was waiting for the insurance confirmation. He was the vulture circling the carcass of my estate. I circled to the rear of the property. Moving through the frozen garden Eleanor had loved so much, the rose bushes were wrapped in burlap, looking like small, huddled figures in the dark. I used my spare key on the mudroom door, my movements silent and practiced. I reached the alarm keypad. The red light blinked like a steady, accusing heartbeat. 0812, August 12th. Daniel's birthday. The code was a structural tieback to the day he was born, a day I had thought was the proudest of my life. Entering those digits now felt like driving a stake into my own chest. System disarmed. I stepped into the house, shedding my boots. The air inside smelled of expensive wine and a floral perfume that made my stomach turn. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew every joist, every floorboard that creaked, every corner where the shadows gathered. I moved like a phantom through my own light. A sliver of light spilled from the kitchen, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood of the hallway. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, the only part of me that was still afraid. "I haven't heard from him," Vanessa's voice hissed. It was stripped of its polished veneer, sounding sharp and jagged. The storm hit the Brooks Range 6 hours ago. Carl isn't answering the encrypted line. The sat phone is dead. I heard the clink of glass against stone, a bottle being set down with trembling hands. Listen to me, Daniel, she continued, her voice dropping to a low, commanding vibrato. The narrative is already set. The guide will make it look like a tragic accident. An old man, confused by the altitude and the medication, wandered away from the cabin. He slipped on the ice of the ridge. He fell. He froze. It is the only logical conclusion. I closed my eyes, the cold from Alaska seemingly blooming in the center of my chest. Ness, I can't do this anymore, Daniel's voice broke. It was a pathetic, whimpering sound, the sound of a structure undergoing total plastic deformation. He's my father. He's the one who taught me how to draw a straight line. We should call the lodge. We should tell them to send a search party. It's too late for conscience, Daniel, Vanessa snapped, and I could hear the slap of her hand on the marble island. The firm is $4 million in the red. You embezzled the retirement funds of 20 employees. If we don't have that $5 million life insurance payout by Friday, Julian Black won't just take the house. He'll take your life. Do you understand the physics of this? We are at the crush depth. No, Daniel sobbed. It was the sound of a man who had sold his soul and realized the check was going to bounce. Then shut up and pour me another drink, Vanessa commanded. We wait for the call from the Fairbanks State Troopers. We play the part of the grieving children. We mourn him until the check clears. I stood in the darkness of the hallway, the anger within me shifting from a wild, chaotic thing to something cold, dense, and structural. They didn't just want me dead. They had handled the value of my expiration. My son hadn't just failed. He had treated my life as a liquid asset. The anger was absolute zero. It was a state where all molecular motion stops. I retreated silently to the mudroom. I pulled my heavy boots back on, lacing them with slow, deliberate movements. I reached for the heavy brass handle of the back door. I didn't just open it. I threw it open so hard the hinges screamed, and then I slammed it shut with a force that sent a shudder through the very frame of the house. It was a seismic event. Hello? I boomed, my voice echoing off the high ceilings like a verdict. I'm home. Is anyone awake? I stood there, a dead man returned from the white void, waiting for the ruins to realize they had been haunted. The sound of the back door slamming was more than a noise. It was a physical percussion that traveled through the floor joists and vibrated in the soles of my feet. It was the sound of a structural failure finally reaching the ears of the residents. In the kitchen, the silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. Then came the crash. It was the high-pitched shatter of a crystal wine glass hitting the granite island, followed by the dull thud of a heavy Cabernet bottle hitting the floor. I walked down the hallway, my heavy boots thumping with deliberate, rhythmic force. Every step was a calculated load on their nerves. I rounded the corner into the kitchen. The scene was a masterpiece of domestic ruin. Red wine splattered across the white cabinetry like an arterial spray. Vanessa stood frozen, her face drained of all color, her hands still clawing at the empty air where her glass had been. Daniel had collapsed against the refrigerator, his knees buckling, his mouth working silently like a fish pulled from the ice. Daniel's voice wasn't a word, it was a fracture. I'm back, I said, my voice booming with a forced manic cheerfulness. I dropped my heavy bag onto the floor with a resounding thud. Worst trip of my life. Can you believe the incompetence out there? A total system failure. I walked toward them, stepping over the puddle of wine as if I didn't see the blood at my feet. I leaned against the counter, letting my hands shake, just enough to look like age-related tremor, rather than the vibrating hum of a man who had just survived an assassination attempt. The guide never showed up. I lied, my voice rising in a pitch of feigned geriatric frustration. I waited at that airstrip for 6 hours. 6 hours, in 30 below weather. I think I've got permanent frostbite on my small toe. I watched Vanessa's eyes. They were darting, scanning me for the pills effect, looking for the confusion Eris Thorne had promised. Her mind was a series of gears grinding against each other, trying to recalibrate the narrative in real time. Carl didn't show? Then Carl isn't dead? Or did Carl miss him? What happened to the accident? He didn't show, Vanessa stammered, Her voice was thin, a structural member under too much tension. But we confirmed everything. We paid for the best. A scam, I snapped, waving a hand dismissively. The company must be a shell. I finally flagged down a local in a battered truck and hitched a ride back to the terminal. I wasn't going to wait around for another minute in that void. I booked the first flight home. First class, thank God. Though the seat didn't recline properly, just another failure of design. I walked over to the refrigerator, nudging Daniel aside. He didn't move. He was a statue of guilt. I opened the door, the hum of the appliance feeling like a low-frequency warning. I'm starving, I said, rummaging through the shelves. Is there any of that roast beef left? Or did you two eat everything while I was away? Bonding with nature. You're alive, Daniel whispered. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the wine on the floor. Then slowly, his eyes drifted up to mine. They were filled with a horrific mixture of relief and absolute terror. He started to cry, not the noble tears of a son reunited with a father, but the pathetic, racking sobs of a man who realized the bridge he'd burned was the only way across the chasm. Of course I'm alive, Danny, I said softly, grabbing a jar of pickles and twisting the lid. The pop of the vacuum seal sounded like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. Why wouldn't I be? It takes more than a little cold to bring down a Penhaligon. We're built for the long haul. I turned my gaze to Vanessa. She had recovered some of her facade, but the cracks were visible now. The way her jaw was clamped, the way her fingers were digging into the edge of the granite counter so hard her knuckles were white. You look disappointed, sweetheart, I said, taking a slow, deliberate bite of a pickle. Are you worried about the refund for the trip? Don't be. I'm going to handle the adjustments personally. No, she shrieked, the sound too loud, too desperate. No, Arthur. I'm in shock. We were so worried about the storm. The news said it was a once-in-a-generation event. We feared the worst. Well, worry no more, I said, chewing slowly. The vinegar tasted like victory. In fact, the isolation gave me a lot of time to think about the future, about the legacy, about the way we've been managing our structural integrity. Vanessa's head snapped up. Greed is an involuntary reflex, a biological impulse that bypasses the conscience. Even in her terror, she heard the word legacy, and she leaned in. I realized that life is a series of unforeseen loads. I continued, pacing the kitchen like an inspector. A slip on the ice, a sudden fall, a heart that stops because it's been under too much pressure for too long. Anything can happen. I saw her flinch. I let the silence hang, heavy and suffocating, like the air before a building collapses. I want to settle things, I said. I'm going to call my lawyer Marcus tomorrow morning. I want to look at the family trust. It's too rigid. It needs more flexibility, more direct oversight. That's a very prudent idea, Arthur, Vanessa said, her voice trembling but her eyes narrowing with a predatory hunger. And, I added, turning to Daniel, who was still slumped against the fridge, I want to conduct a full audit of your firm, Dan. If I'm going to leave you the bulk of the estate, I need to know the foundation is solid. I want to see the books, every ledger, every client account. I'm bringing in my own person. 9 years I am sharp. The color drained from Daniel's face so completely he looked like he'd been carved from salt. But he knew what an audit meant. He knew that once I looked at the load-bearing documents of his life, I would see the embezzlement, the fraud, the hollow core where his integrity used to be. Dad, that's really not necessary, he mumbled, his voice a ghost of itself. We have everything under control. It's just a temporary cash flow issue. I insist, I said, my voice hardening into the tone I used when a contractor tried to hide a crack with plaster. Tomorrow morning, my accountant will be here. We'll sit down right at this table and we'll look at the reality of the situation. I yawned, a fake, theatrical sound that felt like a mockery. I'm going to bed. It's been a long flight, and the altitude has made me very clear-headed. I walked past them, making sure my shoulder brushed against Daniel's. He felt frail, a structure whose support beams had been eaten away by rot. I felt their eyes burning into the back of my neck as I climbed the stairs. I went into my bedroom and locked the door. I didn't turn on the light. I moved the heavy oak chair from the corner and wedged it firmly under the door handle. a simple mechanical brace. Then I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, holding my hunting knife in my hand. I didn't sleep. I listened. I listened to the house. I listened to the hushed, frantic whispers coming from the kitchen below. I listened to the sound of a family trying to decide if they had enough time to kill me again before the sun came up. The game had begun, and unlike the bridge in Alaska, I was the one holding the blueprint. At 4 a.m., the house was a cavern of blue-tinted shadows. I sat by the window in my study, the glass cold enough to numb my forehead. I pulled out the secondary phone, the one they didn't know about. I sent a text to Sarah Jenkins. Sarah, need you. 9 a.m. House. Bring the forensic kit and the deep dive ledger tools. We have a structural collapse in progress. Sarah had been my lead clerk for 15 years before she moved into forensic accounting. She was a woman who saw the world in columns of black and red, a person who understood that numbers, much like steel beams, never lied unless they were forced to. She replied within seconds, "On it, Judge. I'll bring the wrecking ball." I stared out at the street. The black sedan was still there, a dark stain on the pristine snow. It represented a lateral load, an external force pressing against the house, waiting for the internal supports to give way. Julian Black was not a man of patience. He was a man of physics. Pressure times time equals result. Sun. It came down for breakfast at 7:30 a.m. Kitchen was already bright, the light reflecting off the white subway tile with a clinical blinding intensity. Vanessa was there, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She was standing by the high-end espresso machine, the steam hissing like a cornered snake. "Good morning, Arthur," she said, her voice a practiced melody of daughterly concern. "How did you sleep?" "No nightmares of the tundra. The mind is a resilient structure, Vanessa," I said, sitting at the head of the table. "Once you understand the environment, the fear dissipates." She handed me a porcelain mug. I made a fresh pot, dark roast, just the way you like it. I looked at the liquid. It was obsidian, swirling with oily rainbows on the surface. I brought it to my nose. There was the rich scent of beans, yes, but beneath it, something sharp, a faint, metallic tang. In engineering, we call it an admixture, something added to concrete to change its properties, often making it set faster or more brittle. "Is something wrong?" she asked. She was leaning against the counter, her posture a little too rigid, her eyes fixed on my throat. "I think I'll have tea," I said, my voice as casual as a weather report. I stood up, walked to the sink, and poured the steaming coffee down the drain. The dark liquid disappeared into the pipes with a gurgle. "Why?" Her voice snapped, the glass facade showing a hairline fracture. "The doctor said caffeine increases the heart rate," I said, turning to look her in the eye. "And at my age, I can't afford any unnecessary vibrations in the foundation. Can't be too careful, right, sweetheart?" I saw her hand clench into a fist behind her back. Strike one. I left my primary phone on the dining room table while I went to the guest bathroom. I didn't lock the door. I left it cracked just an inch. I stood in the dark of the small room, watching through the gap. Daniel appeared almost instantly. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His skin sallow, his movements jittery. He lunged for the phone. His thumbs flew across the screen, his face lit by the pale glow. He was searching for the call history, looking for Fairbanks, looking for Carl, looking for anyone I might have alerted. I waited until I saw the sweat bead on his forehead. Then I flushed the toilet and stepped out. Daniel dropped the phone as if it had turned into white-hot iron. It clattered onto the hardwood. "Just checking the weather," he stammered, his eyes darting to the window. "Supposed to be a cold one today." "It's always cold when the heat is turned off, Dan," I said, picking up the device. I checked the screen. He hadn't found the encrypted logs. He didn't have the clearance. "Make sure you wear a sweater. You look like you're shivering." Strike two. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It is Frank Miller, my oldest friend and a retired homicide detective. Frank was a man who lived in the shear zones of the city, where the law and the streets rubbed against each other. "Go ahead, Frank," I whispered, standing in the pantry. I ran the plates on that sedan. "Arthur." Frank's voice was a gravelly comfort. "It's registered to a shell company out of Delaware, but the boots on the ground are Julian Black's crew. 2 of them. One's a heavy named Vinny the Glazier. They don't break windows, Arthur. They break people." What's the status? They're waiting for the event. Or they've been told there's a massive liquidity event coming this week. If that insurance check doesn't materialize, they're moving from observation to demolition. You need to get out of there. No, I said, looking through the pantry door at the silhouettes of my son and his wife. A good engineer doesn't leave a failing building until the shoring is in place. Stand by, Frank. I'm going to need a witness when the walls come down. At 10-hour dam, the power flickered. A deliberate brownout. I'll check the fuse box, I announced. Probably a loose connection in the main breaker. I walked down to the basement. It was a space I had finished myself. Poured concrete, reinforced steel joists. A fortress beneath the house. Vanessa followed me. I could hear the click of her heels on the wooden stairs, a rhythmic, predatory sound. I reached the bottom and walked toward the electrical panel. I felt her behind me. The air in the basement was stagnant, heavy with the smell of damp earth and old secrets. It feels damp down here, Arthur, she said. She was standing one step above me on the stairs, her hand resting on the railing. Maybe the foundation is leaking. Maybe it's not as strong as you think. I turned around suddenly. Her hand was raised, hovering just inches from my shoulder. A push from this height onto the concrete floor. A slip that would result in a broken neck. Another unfortunate accident for a man with dementia. Did you drop something, Vanessa? I asked. My voice was low, vibrating with a frequency that suggested a coming earthquake. She froze, her hands slowly lowered, her fingers fluttering like a dying bird. No, she whispered. I was just checking the railing. It feels loose. Unsafe. The railing is anchored with 3-inch lag bolts into solid oak, I said, stepping toward her until we were eye to eye. It's the most stable thing in this house, unlike the people standing on it. Strike 3. I decided to take the fight to the site. I told them I was going for a walk to clear my head. I walked 3 blocks to Dr. Thorne's office, the cold air biting at my lungs, reminding me of the ridge. I bypassed the receptionist and walked straight into Eris Thorne's private office. He looked up from a chart, his expensive silk tie looking like a noose. Arthur, you should have called for an appointment. Show me my file, Eris, I said. I didn't. I stood over his desk like a crane over a construction site. I can't just hand over medical records. I'm the patient, and I'm the former judge, I barked. If you don't open that digital file right now, I'll have the medical board and the DA performing a structural audit on your practice by lunch. His hands shook as he turned the monitor. There it was, a clinical note from 4 days ago. Patient showing accelerated signs of early onset dementia, increasing disorientation, paranoia regarding family members. Recommendation, full-time care and restricted autonomy. Requested by Vanessa Penhaligon, daughter-in-law primary care liaison. You wrote this without even seeing me, I said, the words feeling like ice water in my veins. You signed off on a narrative that would make my accident in Alaska look like a mercy. She told me you were wandering. Arthur, she said you were forgetting Eleanor's name. Thorne stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. She threatened a malpractice suit if I didn't document your decline. She said she was trying to protect the estate. She was setting the stage for a collapse, I said softly, and you provided the forged blueprints. Do you know what happens to architects whose buildings fall down? Eris, they never build again. I leaned in, my shadow covering his desk. You're going to stay here. You're going to wait for my call. And if you even think about warning her, I'll make sure the collapse buries you first. I walked out of the office. The sun was high now, but it provided no warmth. I had the evidence of the conspiracy. Now I just needed to lead them into the final trap, where the truth would be forced out under pressure. I returned to the house at 3 p.m. The air inside felt stagnant, like a sealed tomb. Vanessa was upstairs. I could hear the muffled, frantic pacing of her heels on the master bedroom's hardwood. Daniel was in his home office. The door was closed, but the smell of cheap Coben was leaking through the cracks in the doorframe. I waited until I heard the shower running in the master suite. I moved into Daniel's office. It was a room I had designed for him. Oak built-ins. A drafting table. A space meant for creation. Now it was a site of structural rot. I sat at his desk. I didn't need a key. As an engineer, I knew the tolerances of a standard tumbler lock. I used a tension wrench and a pick from my old field kit. 3 seconds. Click. The drawer slid open with a guilty groan. I found the dossier Sarah had warned me about. It wasn't just a failure of business. It was a total liquefaction of ethics. Foreclosure notices on their dream home. Final warnings from the IRS. They weren't just broke. They were in a state of terminal collapse. And then, at the bottom of the stack, I found the safety net. Life insurance policy, Arthur Penhaligon. Beneficiary, Daniel Penhaligon. Amount, $5 million. Effective date, 2 weeks ago. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It was a masterful imitation. The A had the correct slant. The R had the little hitch I always made. But as a man who had spent 40 years looking at the structural integrity of documents, I saw the shake in the ink. It was a forgery born of desperation. It was a load-bearing lie designed to support a lifestyle they hadn't earned. I took high-resolution photos with my secondary phone. I sent them to Frank and Sarah. Code blue. Tonight, 8:30 p.m. The dining room is the venue. Bring the cavalry, Frank. The structure is about to be demolished. Frank's reply was a single word. Acknowledged. At 7:00 p.m., I called them to the dining room. I had spent the last hour cooking, a task I usually found meditative, but tonight it felt like preparing an execution. I made steak, ribeye, seared in cast iron, butter-basted with rosemary. I served it. The dining room was a space of formal elegance, the crystal chandelier casting hard, refractive light across the mahogany table. I sat at the head. Vanessa and Daniel sat opposite each other. The silence was so thick it felt like it had a physical mass. "This is lovely, Arthur," Vanessa said, her voice trembling as she picked up her knife. She looked like she hadn't slept in 48 hours. Her immaculate blonde hair was starting to fray at the edges. "A celebration for your return." "A celebration of truth, Vanessa," I said, taking a sip of water. I didn't touch the wine. In engineering, we have a saying, the earth eventually claims what the foundation can't hold. I think it's time we look at what's buried under this house. I reached under my chair and pulled out a heavy manila folder, the dossier of their lives. I slid it onto the center of the table. It sat there like a ticking bomb. "Daniel," I said, my voice dropping into the register of a judge, handing down a life sentence. "I looked at your firm's ledgers today." "Well, Sarah did. She's very thorough. You've been running a Ponzi scheme with client retainers. You've embezzled over $2 million to pay for, what, this wine? Vanessa's shoes? The Porsche in the driveway?" Daniel's fork clattered onto his plate. He looked like he was about to vomit. "Dad, I can explain the market shift." "The market didn't shift, Daniel. Your character did," I snapped. I turned my gaze to Vanessa. She was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. The mask was gone. The glass had shattered. "And you, Vanessa," I said, "you owe Julian Black $4 million. You used Daniel's firm as a personal ATM to cover your losses in the luxury flip market. You're not a real estate mogul. You're a gambler who ran out of house money. You don't know what you're talking about," she shrieked. "You're an old man. You're losing your mind." Dr. Thorne said, "Dr. Thorne is currently sitting in his office waiting for the FBI to arrive." I lied, though it would be true by morning. He confessed everything, Vanessa. The dementia diagnosis, the orange pills, the accident, insurance narrative. "It's all over." I leaned forward, the light from the chandelier reflecting in my eyes. "I'm going to give you one chance. One. Because I loved your mother. And because despite everything, you carry my name, Daniel." Daniel looked up, his eyes wet and pleading. "Confess. Right now. Tell me about Alaska. Tell me what you promised, Carl. Tell me how you were going to live with yourself after I was at the bottom of that ridge." "If you do," I continued, my voice softening just a fraction, "I will pay the debt to Julian Black. I will keep you out of the crush zone of the street. I will sell this house, and I will see that you have a roof over your head. But you have to speak the truth." Now, it was a test of material strength. I wanted to see if there was a single ounce of reinforced steel left in my son's soul. Daniel opened his mouth. He looked at me, Then he looked at the forged insurance policy I pulled from the folder and laid on the table. I choked out. "I didn't want to, Dad," she said. "She said the firm was going to fall. She said they would kill us. She said you were old, that you were already half gone, that it would be a mercy, Daniel." "Shut up," Vanessa screamed. She stood up so fast her chair flipped backward, crashing into the sideboard. "He's bluffing," she yelled, her face contorted into something monstrous. "He won't give us a dime. He's going to let us rot. He's always hated me. He's always held the money over our heads like a god." "Daniel," I said, ignoring her, "choose, right now, her lie or the truth that sets you free." Daniel looked at Vanessa. She was vibrating with a terrifying kinetic energy. She looked like a building in the middle of a seismic event, moments away from total collapse. "I'm sorry, Ness," Daniel whispered, his voice a brittle fracture. I can't do it anymore." "You coward," Vanessa shrieked. She didn't reach for her purse. She didn't reach for her phone. She reached for the steak knife on her plate, the heavy, serrated blade I had sharpened myself. She lunged across the mahogany table. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I had calculated the trajectory. I knew the speed of a desperate woman versus the speed of a pre-planned intervention. Crash. The French doors leading to the patio didn't just open. They disintegrated as a flashbang grenade detonated just outside. The sound was a physical blow, a pressure wave that shattered the remaining wine glasses and sent a cloud of dust and light into the room. "Police, drop the weapon. Drop it now." Frank Miller burst through the ruins of the doors, his service weapon leveled at Vanessa's chest. 4 SWAT officers in tactical gear swarmed the room from the hallway, their laser sights dancing across the walls like red fireflies. Vanessa froze. The knife was inches from my throat. She looked at the red dots on her chest. Then she looked at me. "You planned this," she hissed, her voice a jagged ruin. "You weren't the victim. You were the trap." "I'm an engineer, Vanessa," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "I don't just wait for things to fall. I control the demolition." The officers moved in with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. They disarmed Vanessa, forcing her to the floor. She started to scream, a high, piercing sound of pure narcissistic rage. She cursed me. She cursed Eleanor. She cursed the very ground the house was built on. Daniel didn't fight. He didn't even stand up. He sat in his chair, his hands over his ears, sobbing as they pulled his arms behind his back and clicked the cuffs into place. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered as they dragged him toward the door. "I'm so sorry." I stood up. I walked over to him, stopping the officer for a brief second. I looked at my son, the man I had built, the structure I had failed. "I know you are, Daniel," I said, "but a building that's been built on sand has to be torn down before you can ever hope to build on rock again. You're going to prison, and when you get out, we'll see if there's anything left to salvage." I watched them take her out. I watched the flashing blue and red lights through the shattered French doors, reflecting off the snow like the northern lights I had seen in Alaska. The house was silent again, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was the silence of a site that had been cleared. The flashing blue and red strobes finally faded from the neighborhood, leaving behind a darkness that felt different, thinner, colder, and utterly vacant. The sirens had retreated into the distance, taking with them the only family I had left. I stood in the center of the dining room, surrounded by the literal and metaphorical debris of a lifetime's collapse. The French doors were a jagged maw of broken glass. The sub-zero Chicago air rushed in, swirling the curtains and chilling the room until I could see my own breath again, a rhythmic, ghostly puff that reminded me I was still a living system. In engineering, once a structure has undergone a catastrophic failure, you don't just patch the cracks. You evaluate the site. You determine if the ground itself is still viable. I walked to the table and picked up the bottle of Cabernet. It was a fine vintage, expensive and complex. But as I poured a small amount into a fresh glass, the scent was overpowering, smelled of fermented grapes, and the metallic tang of betrayal. I took a sip. It was bitter, dry, and left an ashen aftertaste in my mouth. I wasn't celebrating. There is no joy in a controlled demolition when you're the one who has to live in the clearing. I moved into the study, the floorboards creaking under my feet like a ship's deck in a storm. I sat in my leather chair and picked up the framed photograph of Eleanor and the soft amber glow of the desk lamp. Her eyes seemed to hold a weary sort of wisdom. "You tried to tell me, Ellie," I whispered, my voice sounding brittle in the empty house. "You saw the sheer points before I did." I remembered her quiet reservations about Vanessa during their first Thanksgiving. The way she'd noted how Vanessa never looked at the person she was talking to, only at the room they were standing in, as if calculating its square footage and resale value. I had dismissed it as motherly protection. I had assumed that my son's foundation was reinforced with the same steel I had tried to forge into him. I was wrong. I had spent my life inspecting the work of others while a slow, silent rot was eating away at the core of my own home. A memory surfaced, unbidden and brutal. Daniel, at 7 years old, sitting on this very rug, building a tower out of wooden blocks. He'd been so meticulous, his small tongue poked out in concentration. When the tower grew too tall and began to lean, he hadn't tried to stabilize it. He'd looked at me with those dark analytical eyes and asked, "Dad, can we make it fall now?" Even then, he was more interested in the collapse than the construction. I had mistaken his fascination with physics for a talent for creation. I realized now that Daniel didn't have the stomach for the long-term load. He only understood the impulse of the moment. He had sold his father for a life insurance policy because he couldn't bear the pressure of his own failures. My phone buzzed. It was Frank. "Arthur, they're processed. Vanessa's not talking, but Daniel's spilling everything. He's naming names. Arthur. Julian Black's crew, the shell companies. The works. He's trying to buy his way into a lighter sentence." "Let him," I said. He was always good at negotiating the price of a ruin. And Arthur, the black sedan, is gone. My guys followed it to a warehouse in Cicero. Julian Black knows the judge is back on the bench. He won't be coming for you. The debt died with the arrest. Thanks, Frank, for everything. I hung up and walked to the window. The street was pristine, the snow covering the tracks of the police cars as if they were never there. The vultures had moved on to easier prey. I was no longer a carcass. I was a fortress. I picked up the glossy brochure for the Aurora Wilderness Lodge from the desk. I looked at the green ribbons of light over the frozen peaks. It was a beautiful image, a promise of peace that had been used as a lure for my execution. I thought about Carl, somewhere at the bottom of Dead Man's Drop, buried under 1,000 tons of indifferent snow. He was a variable that had been neutralized by the very environment he claimed to master. I didn't need to go to Alaska to see the darkness. I didn't need to stand on a ridge to feel the wind try to tear me apart. I had survived the coldest winter of the soul right here in this colonial house. I walked to the kitchen and dropped the brochure into the trash bin. It landed on top of the spilled roast beef and the shards of the wine bottle. I spent the next hour sweeping. It was a mechanical, meditative task. The broom made a shushing sound against the hardwood, the sound of clearing away the past. I swept up the glass from the French doors. I wiped the blood of the red wine from the white cabinets. I worked until my hands were steady and my heart had slowed to a resting pulse. I was 68 years old. My wife was gone. My son was a felon. My house was a hollow shell. But as I stood in the middle of the clean, quiet kitchen, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of lightness. The live load of the lie had been removed. The pressure was gone. Tomorrow, I would call the contractors. I wouldn't just fix the doors, I would redesign the space. I would trap the house down to its studs, if I had to. I would find the rot, and I would replace it with something unyielding. I turned off the kitchen lights. I walked up the stairs, my knees no longer popping, my gait certain. I didn't lock my bedroom door tonight. I didn't need a chair under the handle. The threats were no longer inside the house. The gavel had fallen. The sentence was being served for the first time in 2 years. The silence in the house didn't feel heavy. It felt like a clean, blank blueprint. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since Eleanor died, I slept without the fear of falling. The blueprint is clear now, but even the strongest foundation needs a witness to help hold the weight. If you value the truth that remains after the storm, subscribe to stay with me for the stories yet to be built, like this, to let me know you're here, and tell me, where in this world are you standing on solid ground tonight?